The winding road to Oakhaven was a threadbare ribbon unraveling through a landscape bruised by perpetual twilight. Cole gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the rhythmic churn of the tires on damp asphalt a dull counterpoint to the hollow ache in his chest. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, since the last brushstroke had felt true, since the last laugh had sounded real. He was a husk, his art a barren field, and the inheritance of Blackwood Manor felt less like a gift and more like a final, desperate pilgrimage. He needed a fresh canvas, a stark change, anything to scrape away the ossified grief and the suffocating creative block. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and decaying kelp as his worn vehicle crested a final rise. Below, Oakhaven huddled against the churning gray of the North Sea, a cluster of weathered stone buildings clinging precariously to the rugged coastline. A lone, skeletal finger of an abandoned lighthouse stood sentinel on a distant promontory, its glassless eye staring blankly into the mist. It was a bleak welcome, mirroring the desolation in Cole's soul. Blackwood Manor itself loomed atop a sheer cliff, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. Its gables were sharp teeth, its windows vacant eyes, and the entire structure seemed to be exhaling a sigh of ancient neglect. Moss clung to its slate roof like a shroud, and ivy wrestled with the stone walls, its tendrils thick as ropes. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, groaned a protest as he pushed it open, the sound scraping across the stillness. The drive, choked with weeds, led him to a heavy oak door, its varnish long since flaked away, revealing the gray, splintered wood beneath. He fumbled with the oversized, ornate key, its cold metal biting into his palm. The lock mechanism groaned, then clicked with a metallic clang that echoed disproportionately in the heavy air. As the door swung inward, a gust of air, thick with the scent of dust, damp earth, and something vaguely metallic, rushed out to greet him. It was a smell that spoke of long-forgotten secrets, of things left undisturbed for decades. The foyer was a cavernous maw, swallowed by an oppressive gloom. Even in the middle of the afternoon, light struggled to penetrate the grime-streaked windows, casting the space in a perpetual twilight. His gaze drifted upwards, drawn by the silent watchers. Men and women, young and old, their faces rendered in various styles and eras, all shared a common thread, their eyes. They weren't just painted eyes, they were seeing eyes, following him with a disconcerting intensity. Their gazes were not curious or benevolent, but held a deep, unsettling familiarity, a silent judgment that prickled at the back of his neck. One particular portrait, a severe-looking woman with a high collar and an unyielding expression, seemed to bore into him, her lips a thin, disapproving line. Cole dropped his duffel bag onto the scuffed, intricate pattern of a faded rug. He stepped further inside, his boots echoing on the polished wood floor, each sound amplified in the vast, empty space. He pushed open the door to what appeared to be a drawing room, its furniture draped in white sheets that looked like spectral figures frozen in time. He spun, but nothing was there. Just the dusty, still room. He tried to rationalize it, attributing it to the play of light through the grimy panes, or perhaps his own exhaustion manifesting as visual tricks. Yet, the unease lingered, a faint tremor beneath his resolve. He walked deeper into the manor, his hand trailing along a banister thick with dust. Up the grand staircase he went, the wood groaning beneath his weight, each step sounding like a sigh. A floorboard creaked loudly from somewhere above him, a distinct, deliberate sound, not the settling of an old house, but a slow shift of weight. Cole froze, his breath catching in his throat. He was alone. He was certain of it. The sound didn't repeat. He told himself it was the house, a century of stress fractures and shifting timbers, a natural consequence of its age. He pressed on, his jaw tight, determined to face whatever this place held. He had come too far, lost too much, to be deterred by creaking floors and painted eyes. This was his inheritance, and he would claim it, whatever its cost. The initial days at Blackwood Manor had blurred into a monotonous stretch of gray, much like the ceaseless drizzle that coated Oakhaven. Cole had tried to immerse himself in his art, to coax the familiar magic from his brushes, but the canvas remained a mocking expanse of white. The grief that had driven him here, a raw, exposed nerve, now felt compounded by the house itself. Its silence was less a comfort and more a heavy shroud, muffling his own thoughts until they felt foreign, distant. He'd set up his easel in the grand, drafty drawing room, hoping the panoramic view of the churning sea would inspire something beyond the pervasive melancholy. Yet, the sea, a slate-gray behemoth constantly battering the cliffs, only mirrored the turmoil within him. One afternoon, after a particularly fruitless session, he left a half-finished landscape on the easel, a crude sketch of a gnarled oak clinging to the precipice. When he returned hours later, after a cold supper of tinned soup, the painting was not as he'd left it. The canvas had been subtly shifted, rotated perhaps a degree or two to the left. He stared, then straightened it with a grunt, dismissing it as a trick of the light, or perhaps the house settling. Old houses did that, he reasoned. The next morning, the grand piano in the parlor, a dust-shrouded behemoth he hadn't touched, seemed to hum with a faint, almost inaudible resonance. He passed the open parlor door, and a wisp of a melody, high and reedy, seemed to drift from its keys. It was a tune he didn't recognize, fragile and mournful, like a lullaby played on a broken music box. Cole froze, his hand already reaching for the doorknob of the study. He listened, straining. The sound faded, leaving only the relentless sigh of the wind through the eaves. He told himself it was the wind, whistling through a loose pane, creating a strange harmonics. But the melody had been too distinct, too structured, for mere wind. He began to feel it then, a persistent chill that had nothing to do with the damp coastal air. It was a prickle on the nape of his neck, a sensation of being observed, not just by the stern faces in the ancestral portraits that lined the manor's walls, but by something unseen, something just beyond the periphery of his vision. The house felt like a vast, watchful eye, its many windows glaring out at the perpetual twilight. The unease became a constant companion, a low thrum beneath his skin. Rationalizations began to crumble. He started searching. Not for answers, not yet, but for a logical explanation. He examined the windows for drafts, the floorboards for settling, the plumbing for groans. His search led him to the study, a room overflowing with generations of accumulated clutter. He pulled out a small, tarnished brass key. It was ornate, with a peculiar, angular design. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a small, locked mahogany box on a high shelf, tucked away behind a globe. He hadn't noticed it before, lost amongst the other curiosities. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a single, leather-bound diary. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded to sepia. The first few entries were mundane, chronicling weather and harvests. But then, the tone shifted. The tides grow restless. Great-grandfather spoke of the old ways, the necessary bargain. A heavy price, but the prosperity of Oak Haven depends upon it. Another entry, weeks later, the child's fever broke. The offering was accepted. The sea gives back what it takes. Cole's stomach twisted. What offering? What bargain? The last entry was a desperate scrawl, it knows. It watches. The debt is never truly paid. The name signed at the bottom was Elias Blackwood, a distant relative he vaguely recalled from a dusty family tree. He needed air, perspective. He drove his car through the winding, fog-laden roads, past the skeletal trees and the skeletal houses of Oak Haven, until he reached the coast again. The destination he sought was a landmark, a stark, solitary sentinel against the gray sky, the abandoned lighthouse. The wind here was a physical force, tearing at his coat, carrying the salty tang of the frigid sea. He walked the perimeter, tracing the outline of its decay, the diary's words echoing in his mind. As he rounded the base, he saw him. An old man, his face a road map of weathered lines, sat hunched on a driftwood log, mending a fishing net with practiced, gnarled hands. His eyes, the color of sea glass, fixed on Cole with an unnerving intensity. "Lost, are we?" the old man rasped, his voice gravelly, like stones tumbling on a shore. He didn't wait for a reply. Always a stranger, drawn to the old house. He has a way of calling them in. Cole felt a shiver trace his spine. Cole inherited Blackwood Manor, he said, the words feeling thin in the vastness. The old man nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping from Cole to the distant, fog-shrouded cliffs where the manor stood. "Ah, Blackwood. A deep root, that one. Some roots, they go down further than you'd think. Tap into things best left undisturbed." He paused, his needle weaving a precise knot. "The town, she has a heavy past, you see. An old understanding. Oakhaven owes its fortune to certain arrangements. The sea, she gives, but she always asks for her due. And the Blackwoods, they've always been the keepers of the ledger." Cole's throat felt tight. "What kind of arrangements?" The old man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "The old ways, boy. Before your time. Before many times. Best not to pry too deep. Some truths are like the undertow. Pull you down, and you never see the sun again." He looked at Cole again, his eyes holding an ancient, knowing sorrow. "The house, she has a long memory." The old man's words clung to Cole like the Oakhaven fog, damp and chilling. "The house, hee-ha." The unfinished thought, the ancient sorrow in the elder's eyes, etched themselves into Cole's mind. He had left the general store with a knot tightening in his gut, a cold certainty that the answers he sought would not be found in the town's hushed whispers, but within the decaying walls of Blackwood Manor itself. A determined resolve solidified in him, pushing past the tremor of unease. He would pry. He would go deep. Returning to the manor, the salt-laced wind seemed to howl a warning through the skeletal trees. The house loomed, a gaunt silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes. He felt its presence now, not just as a structure, but as something sentient, watchful. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew, old paper, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like brine and rust. Cole went straight to the study, the room where his ancestor, Elias Blackwood, had spent his final, tormented years. He remembered the faint scorch marks on the desktop, the dried ink stains. There had to be something more. He pulled open drawers, sifting through brittle invoices and forgotten letters. Nothing. His gaze fell upon a loose panel behind a heavy, carved leg of the desk, almost imperceptible. He pressed it, and with a faint click, a narrow compartment sprang open. Inside lay a single, leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a faded, swirling crest that mirrored the one above the manor's grand fireplace. Cole settled into Elias's old chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and opened the journal. The pages were yellowed, brittle, covered in an elegant, spidery script that grew increasingly erratic with each passing entry. August 14, 1872. The blight consumes all. Our nets are empty, the crops wither. Oakhaven starves. The sea, once our giver, now only takes. There is talk of abandoning the settlement. Despair hangs like a shroud. Cole's breath hitched. He could almost hear the gnawing hunger, feel the crushing hopelessness of that time. He turned the page, the paper rustling like dry leaves. September 3, 1872. Not a voice, but a knowing. It offers. It demands. The old man's words echoed. The old ways. September 10, 1872. The bargain is struck. It asks for not blood, not coin. It asks for connection, for isolation. For despair to be cultivated, a rich soil for its roots. Cole's hands trembled, the journal almost slipping from his grasp. A name, finally, and a pact. Not for gold, but for despair. He thought of his own isolation, his own recent grief, his creative block, a fertile ground, indeed. He was not just living in Blackwood Manor, he was part of its harvest. The entries grew frantic. October 29, 1873. The bounty flows. Oak Haven thrives. But at night, Cole hear it. The murmur. The tide's relentless pull. It speaks of the others. Of those who nourished it before. Their minds, their souls. Absorbed. March 12, 1874. My thoughts are not my own. They are the echoes of the pact, the price paid in sanity. It wants me to be alone. Always alone. July 1, 1875. The lighthouse. It calls. A place of power, a beacon of. What? It watches. It waits. Cole must go. Cole must understand the extent of this terrible legacy. The next one must be warned. If Cole can still warn. The final entry was a scrawl, almost illegible, ending abruptly with a blotch of dried ink. Cole's heart hammered against his ribs. The abandoned lighthouse. A crucial link. The air thickened, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. The distant crash of waves against the cliffs intensified, sounding like a hungry roar. Cole squeezed his eyes shut, then snapped them open. It was gone. The despair in the room was no longer just an echo, it was a living, breathing thing, wrapping around him. He had to go. He needed to be outside, away from the suffocating presence of the house. He grabbed a heavy coat and stumbled out into the night, the journal clutched tight in his hand. The fog had rolled in, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the path ahead. But he knew where he was going. Elias's final, desperate journey. The walk was a struggle, the fog disorienting, the wind biting. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself resisted him. Finally, through the swirling mist, the gaunt silhouette of the abandoned lighthouse emerged, a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the sky. Its windows were broken eyes, its stone exterior scarred by decades of salt and wind. Inside, the spiral staircase wound upwards into the blackness, each step groaning under his weight. He reached the top, the glassless lantern room open to the elements. The wind howled through the gaps, a mournful, incessant cry. The sound of the waves below was deafening, a monstrous exhalation. And then, amidst the roar, he heard it again. You are alone. You are ours. His vision blurred. The fog outside swirled into forms, indistinct and shifting. He saw a face, gaunt and terrified, Elias Blackwood's face, screaming silently from the mist. Then, it shifted, coalescing into something vast, ancient, with eyes like the deepest parts of the ocean. It was not a physical manifestation, not entirely. It was a projection of pure, terrifying presence, a psychic assault. The despair he'd felt in the house was nothing compared to this. It was a tidal wave of sorrow, isolation, and an all-consuming hunger that threatened to drown him whole. He was the latest sacrifice, the next conduit. The vastness of that oceanic gaze, seen only for a flickering instant in the swirling mist, ripped through Cole's carefully constructed defenses. It wasn't a trick of the light, nor a figment of his imagination fueled by exhaustion and old papers. It was a presence, immense and ancient, and it had seen him. He stumbled back from the window, his breath catching in his throat, the phantom chill of the sea thing's gaze clinging to his skin like brine. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to force the image away, to find purchase in the familiar, if unsettling, reality of Blackwood Manor. But the manor itself felt different now. His thoughts clawed back to Elias Blackwood, to the desperate scrawl in the journal. Elias's artistic despair, his inability to paint, his sense of being utterly alone in a world that refused to see him, it was a mirror. He hadn't just inherited a house, he had inherited a legacy of grief, a lineage of isolation. A sudden, sharp gust rattled the window panes, a sound like a hungry growl. This place, this thing, was feeding on him, on the very emptiness he carried. He snatched up Elias's final journal, the one detailing the pact, and flipped through its brittle pages, his fingers trembling. It wasn't just a lament, it was a bargain. The tide demands. The artist's despair, a canvas for its will. A life given, a soul claimed. Cole's eyes scanned the words, then darted to the margins where Elias had sketched a crude, disturbing image, a figure, gaunt and featureless, standing before a churning sea, its hands outstretched, not in supplication. In a strange, terrible offering. And in the corner, almost hidden, was a small, familiar symbol, the stylized wave pattern he'd seen carved into the manor's oldest lintels, the same one etched into the frame of the portrait that haunted the main hall. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Elias hadn't just been a victim, he had been a part of it. And his despair, his artistic block, his isolation, they weren't just personal tragedies, they were the very conditions the entity cultivated. Cole wasn't just a new owner, he was the latest intended sacrifice. He was being fattened, groomed for consumption. A primal scream tore at his throat, but no sound escaped. Now. He fumbled with the heavy front door, throwing it open to a world transformed. The sky had turned a bruised purple, the air thick with the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Wind whipped his hair across his face, stinging his eyes with sea spray. He stumbled down the overgrown drive, his feet slipping on wet gravel, towards his car. He yanked open the driver's side door, slid in, and jammed the key into the ignition. He turned it. Nothing. The battery was dead. Completely. Impossible. He'd driven it just yesterday. The engine had been fine. This wasn't just a storm. This wasn't just bad luck. The house, the entity, was actively conspiring to keep him. He was trapped. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the sound swallowed by the rising howl of the wind. Then, through the torrent of rain and the deepening gloom, a faint, intermittent beam of light cut through the roiling fog on the distant headland. The abandoned lighthouse. Elias had mentioned it, not in his journals about the pact, but in an earlier, more hopeful entry, as a place of quiet contemplation, a vantage point where he felt closest to the raw power of the ocean, before that power had become something monstrous. A desperate, irrational hope flickered within Cole. Perhaps there, away from the immediate influence of the manor, he could find a way. Or perhaps, in his ancestors' twisted logic, it was another nexus, another place where the veil between worlds thinned. Regardless, it was his only direction, his only movement forward in a world suddenly intent on holding him still. He got out of the car, the wind nearly tearing the door from his grasp. The rain was coming down in sheets now, visibility plummeting. The path to the lighthouse would be treacherous, cutting across the cliffs, exposed to the full fury of the gale. But the alternative was to remain in the manor, a sacrifice waiting to be claimed. He pulled his jacket tighter, hunching his shoulders against the onslaught. The roar of the ocean was deafening, a hungry, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. Each step was a battle against the wind, each breath a struggle against the salt-laced air. The crude sketch in Elias's journal, the gaunt figure offering itself to the churning sea, had etched itself into Cole's vision. It flickered behind his eyelids, a constant, silent accusation. He sat hunched over the ancestors' leather-bound books at the heavy oak desk, the lamplight throwing his shadow long and distorted across the wall. The house creaked around him, a mournful symphony of old timber and sea wind.
Determination, a fragile shield against the creeping dread, stiffened his spine. He had to understand. The entity's influence, however, was no longer subtle. A half-finished canvas in his London studio, its vibrant hues now mocking him with their incompleteness, flashed in his mind. The sharp tang of turpentine and linseed oil, once a comfort, now smelled like decay. Unfinished. Unworthy. It was his own voice, yet warped, laced with a venomous satisfaction. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the brittle pages before him. Elias's handwriting, once neat, grew increasingly frantic in the later entries, sprawling across the margins, underlined with desperate emphasis. Cole's fingers, stained with old ink and dust, traced the lines. Elias wrote of the town's prosperity, yes, but also of a growing sense of emptiness. The bounty is a cage, one entry read. It gives, but it takes more than coin. It takes the spirit. It takes the song from the heart. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, and a faint, briny smell, like old salt and something else, something metallic and ancient, drifted in. They were a chorus, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the house. They spoke of his isolation, the self-imposed exile that had brought him here. Alone. Always alone. Even in your art, you found no solace. Cole gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. His deepest fear, that he was inherently flawed, destined for solitude and creative oblivion, was being weaponized against him. He felt a profound, aching loneliness, sharper than any he had ever known. It was as if the entity was reaching into his past, pulling out every regret, every sorrow, and amplifying it, twisting it into a weapon aimed directly at his resolve. He forced his attention back to the journal. It wasn't just a life, Elias explained with growing horror, but the very essence of a person. The prosperous ancestors weren't just dying, they were being erased, their identities fed to something ancient and insatiable. Then, Cole found it. A series of frantic sketches and notes in a later volume, nearly illegible, but crucial. Elias, realizing his own impending doom, had desperately sought a way out, or at least a way to understand the final ritual. He had drawn a crude map, leading to a specific location. And beside it, a stark, terrifying revelation, the convergence point. Where the veil thins. Where the tide claims its own. The sketches depicted a towering structure, weather-beaten and solitary, standing sentinel on the jagged coast. Cole's breath hitched. It was unmistakable. The abandoned lighthouse. Elias had scrawled a warning beneath the drawing, there, the offering is complete. Not a death, but a dissolution. This wasn't just about dying, it was about ceasing to exist, about his consciousness being devoured, his identity wiped clean. The entity didn't want his life, it wanted his soul, his very being, leaving nothing but an empty vessel for its influence. This was the true, horrific cost of the pact, the legacy he had inherited. He wasn't just the latest sacrifice, he was the final ingredient in a monstrous recipe. A wave of nausea washed over him, and for a moment, the room spun. He heard the faint, rhythmic pulse of the sea, no longer just a sound, but a felt vibration in the floorboards, a slow, inexorable heartbeat. He squeezed his eyes shut again, fighting the urge to scream, to flee. But where would he go? The house, the town, the very air, felt saturated with the entity's presence. He was trapped. He wouldn't let it happen. He wouldn't be erased. He would fight. He would go to the abandoned lighthouse, not as a lamb to the slaughter, but as a man seeking to break the chains that bound him, even if it meant confronting the very source of his nightmares. The realization had been a cold, stark thing, a truth hammered into his consciousness with the precision of a master artisan. Cole stood in the flickering gloom of the great hall, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with a furious, desperate resolve.
He would not be consumed.
He would not surrender to the tide that whispered his name.
But how do you fight something that has no form, no tangible presence, only a creeping, suffocating influence? There was a focal point, he was sure of it, a conduit through which the entity's tendrils extended into the house, into him. He remembered the specific, particularly grotesque portrait in the main gallery, a man with eyes like stagnant pools, a sneer frozen on his lips, somehow more alive, more present than the others.
That had to be it.
With a deep, shuddering breath, Cole began his descent into the manor's deeper levels, towards the gallery.
Each step on the creaking floorboards was a deliberate act of defiance.
It was a trick, a cruel manipulation. This was the entity trying to break him before he even reached his target. He pushed through a set of heavy, oak doors, their hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the gallery.
The portraits, dozens of them, lined the walls, their painted eyes now seeming to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light. His gaze fixed on that portrait, the one of the sneering man. It seemed to pulse with a sickly, internal light, its canvas rippling as if the oil paint was still wet, still shifting. This was the anchor.
He felt it, a profound, sickening connection.
"You won't have me," Cole rasped, his voice raw.
He snatched a heavy, ornate brass letter opener from a nearby antique desk, a relic that felt solid and real in his trembling hand. He raised it, his arm shaking, and plunged it into the canvas, aiming for the man's heart. A shriek, not of sound, but of pure, psychic agony, ripped through the gallery. The air turned to ice, and the floor beneath him bucked. Paintings crashed from the walls, their frames shattering, their canvases tearing. Cole staggered back, clutching his head as his mind reeled. The room dissolved around him, the walls blurring into a maelstrom of dark water, the floor becoming slick with the cold, viscous liquid that seeped into his shoes. He was drowning, not in water, but in sorrow, in the overwhelming weight of every loss he had ever known, magnified 1,000-fold. He fell to his knees, gasping, battling the illusion. This was the entity's true power, a direct assault on his sanity. It wanted to drown him in his own grief, to unravel the very threads of his being. But even as the despair threatened to consume him, a flicker of stubborn defiance ignited. He forced his eyes open, tearing them away from the phantom images. The gallery was still a tempest, but the walls were reforming, albeit warped and distorted. Where the portrait of the sneering man had hung, the canvas was now ripped, a jagged tear exposing the plaster wall behind it. And there, revealed by the damage, was something else. Not just plaster. A faint, almost invisible seam, a hairline crack running vertically down the wall, partially obscured by generations of dust and grime. Driven by a desperate hunch, Cole scrambled forward, his fingers scraping at the wall. The seam was too perfect, too deliberate to be a natural crack. He pushed, he pulled, he felt along its length. His fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible button, hidden in the ornate carving of the wainscoting. He pressed it. With a soft click and a groan of ancient mechanisms, a section of the wall where the portrait had hung slid inward, then swung silently open, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. It was a passage into the very guts of the house, a forgotten chamber. But this was a chance, a perilous, terrifying chance. He had pushed the entity, and it had pushed back with a fury that nearly broke him. But in its rage, it had revealed a secret. A secret that smelled of the sea, and hinted at a desperate, terrifying path to the abandoned lighthouse. Cole stood in the gallery, the oppressive weight of the portraits pressing in on him. A trick, he thought, his jaw tight. A cruel manipulation. The entity was trying to break him before he even reached his target, before he could find the core of its sickening power. Outside, the world had descended into a maelstrom. The wind howled like a banshee, a physical force that rattled the very foundations of Blackwood Manor. Rain lashed against the ancient glass of the gallery windows, not in drops, but in sheets, obscuring the churning, ink-black sea below. Thunder cracked, a deafening drumbeat that vibrated through the floorboards and up into Cole's bones, punctuated by flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the tumultuous coastline. In those fleeting moments, he could glimpse the silhouette of the abandoned lighthouse on the distant promontory, a stark, broken finger pointing at the raging heavens, a lonely sentinel long abandoned to the elements, much like his own family had been abandoned to this legacy. The storm was a living thing, a primal scream mirroring the chaos brewing within the house, within himself.
He wasn't running anymore.
His grief, his isolation, the creative block that had gnawed at him for months, they were weaknesses the entity had exploited, not inherent flaws. He had been drawn here, yes, but not to surrender. He had been drawn here to fight. He had pieced together fragments from dusty journals and cryptic letters hidden within the manor, enough to understand the pact, enough to know its hunger.
He didn't have all the answers, but he had a name, the Whispering Tide. And he had a purpose, to end it. Cole turned from the portraits, his gaze sweeping the familiar yet suddenly alien architecture of the manor. The entity's presence was no longer a subtle whisper in the periphery, it was a cold, cloying humidity that seeped into every pore, a pressure in his skull, a discordant hum that made the very air vibrate. He needed to find its heart, the nexus of its power within these walls. He remembered a recurring symbol in the journals, a stylized wave, curling inward, always pointing towards the deepest, oldest parts of the house. He passed through the grand ballroom, now a cavernous space where dust motes danced in the gloom, illuminated by the frantic stabs of lightning. He descended into the labyrinthine cellars, the damp earth smell mingling with something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust and stagnant water. He checked behind false walls, beneath loose floorboards, in forgotten alcoves. Nothing. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, each step a protest. The air grew thinner, tinged with the scent of aged parchment and something acrid, like ozone and decay. He found a hidden staircase behind a tapestry depicting a stormy sea, the recurring wave motif. The stairs spiraled down, not up, into unexpected depths. The descent was steep, the stone steps slick with a subtle, unidentifiable slime. At the bottom, a heavy, iron-bound door stood sentinel. With a grunt, Cole pushed. The door scraped open with a sound like grinding teeth, revealing a chamber beyond. This was it. The room was circular, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the manor. In the center, a shallow pool of water pulsed with a faint, phosphorescent glow, its surface unnaturally still, despite the tremor of the manor above. And within that pool, half submerged, lay a grotesque sculpture. It was not carved, but seemed grown, organic and alien, a twisting mass of what looked like petrified tentacles and barnacled flesh, all coalescing into a single, obsidian eye that stared blankly upwards. This was the entity's heart, its ritual site. The raw, unfiltered power radiating from it was suffocating. As Cole stared, transfixed by the horror, the water in the pool began to churn, slowly at first, then with increasing violence, mirroring the storm outside. The phosphorescent glow intensified, casting the obsidian room in an eerie, green light. A deep, resonant hum filled the chamber, growing in pitch and intensity, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his skull, vibrating his very teeth. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick and viscous, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. From the obsidian eye in the pool, tendrils of black mist began to unfurl, coiling upwards, swirling and coalescing. It was roaring. Its true, terrifying manifestation was beginning, pulled from the depths, drawn into this chamber by centuries of pact and sacrifice. The swirling mist took on an impossible scale, filling the chamber, pressing against the walls, yet somehow expanding beyond the confines of the room, as if the very fabric of reality was stretching to accommodate its monstrous presence. Cole felt his sanity fraying at the edges, the sheer, alien vastness of the entity threatening to overwhelm him. But he wouldn't break. Not now. He gripped the heavy, antique silver letter opener he'd found tucked away in a desk drawer, a strange,
desperate weapon, but the only one he had. He didn't know if it would work, if anything could truly harm such a thing, but he would try. He took a ragged breath, the thick air burning his lungs. The final confrontation was here. He would face it, or he would die trying. He had pushed through the heavy oak doors, their hinges screaming in protest like tortured souls, but now his gaze swept past the leering visages, past the shadowed canvases. He wouldn't be another sacrifice. Join us. Embrace the quietude. But Cole knew its peace was a lie, a slow, agonizing dissolution of self. The abandoned lighthouse. He moved through the decaying halls with a purpose he hadn't known he possessed. Outside, the fog had thickened to an impenetrable shroud, muffling the world. The churning roar of the sea was a constant, guttural presence, guiding him, pulling him. The path to the cliffs was treacherous, slick with salt spray and ancient moss. He stumbled, caught himself, his hands scraping against the rough stone of the manor's outer wall. The journey to the abandoned lighthouse was a descent into sensory deprivation, punctuated by the relentless assault of the elements. The wind howled a dirge, tearing at his clothes, stinging his eyes with microscopic shards of salt. The ground beneath his feet became a treacherous mix of loose shale and clinging mud. He could barely see his outstretched hand, yet a primal instinct, a pull towards the source of his torment, kept him moving. He thought of his lost wife, of the blank canvases in his studio, of the creative well that had run dry. Finally, a hulking silhouette emerged from the swirling gray, the abandoned lighthouse. The iron door, rusted solid, hung ajar, groaning faintly in the wind. The stench of salt and damp stone was overwhelming here, mixed with something else, something ancient and metallic, like old blood. He pushed the door inward. The interior was a spiral of crumbling stone steps, winding upwards into the unseen. He ascended, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. Each step felt like a climb into a deeper layer of himself, shedding the last vestiges of the man he had been. At the top, the lantern room was open to the elements, the shattered remnants of its glass enclosure scattered across the floor like frozen tears. The raw, tumultuous sea stretched out before him, a vast, gray expanse swallowed by the fog. It was a suffocating pressure, a vast, formless consciousness that pressed against his mind, seeking entry. It wasn't a voice, but a chorus of thoughts, memories, and emotions that weren't his own, the despair of generations, the silent cries of the sacrificed, the ravenous hunger of an ancient thing. Give yourself. Release. Become one. Cole staggered back, clutching his head. The images flooded him, visions of Oakhaven's prosperity, built on the slow, deliberate draining of souls, of artists. And dreamers whose creativity had been twisted into tools for the entity's sustenance. He saw the truth of the pact, not merely a life taken, but the essence of the individual, their unique spark, their ability to create, consumed to fuel the entity's continued existence, ensuring the town's unnatural prosperity. The entity didn't just want his life, it wanted his art, the very unique way he saw and translated the world. It wanted to consume his vision, leaving him an empty vessel. He had to destroy his ability to create, to render himself useless to it. He looked out at the churning sea, at the endless gray. The sacrifice wasn't his life, but his soul's purest expression. He visualized his artistic spirit, his unique way of seeing the world, not as something to be cherished, but as something to be cauterized, burned away. It was a brutal, self-inflicted amputation of his very essence. A scream tore through the air, not from Cole, but from the entity itself, a vast, formless shriek of outrage and pain that vibrated through the very stones of the lighthouse. The wind picked up, a furious gale that rattled the ancient structure. Below, the sea churned with a terrifying violence, crashing against the cliffs. The very ground trembled. Cole stumbled, scrambling down the winding steps of the abandoned lighthouse as the air filled with the groaning protest of stone and mortar. The lighthouse, no longer sustained by the pact it had witnessed for centuries, began to crumble. He fled the cliffs, not looking back, the sound of the collapsing structure a thunderous punctuation to his escape.
He didn't return to Blackwood Manor. Cole survived. He left Oak Haven in the dead of night, leaving behind the town, the manor, the sea, and the ghost of his former self. He found no solace in new landscapes, no inspiration in fresh canvases. The world was flat now, muted, devoid of the vibrant hues and intricate patterns he once perceived. The emptiness within him was a constant companion, a stark reminder of the price of his survival. He was free, but irrevocably scarred. Merely dormant, waiting for another artist, another soul, to come too close to the sea?